Good evening, everyone, at least all us people in the Northern Hemisphere. Good afternoon for Arno down in Australia. Welcome to the Astro Imaging channel. This is our last program of the year. We're going to be off for the next 2 weeks, so this is a special program. We're having Jon Talbot here, but I'm not going to go over the schedule, but you know, we're always looking for presenters, so if you'd like to make a presentation, just send us a note from our website and someone will be in contact with you and we'll hook you up. Anyway, before we get into Jon's show, David Pearson, who's going to be our speaker for the new year in 3 weeks. David's on the show tonight and you want to tell us a little bit about, you know, what your presentation is going to be.
Sure. Hello. In 2019, I moved my 12-inch scope from local observatory to a remote observatory about 900 miles away. And the biggest issue I had was trying to keep my plate full of images. Since you can shoot, you know, all night long, almost every night with good weather, that I just had difficulty. I had to keep every day, come up with objects, transform them into my planner, and then execute. And that was always kind of just took a lot of time. So I decided, shoot, I'm just going to write me a script that's going to do all that for me. So I wrote a script that basically can be unattended for whatever period of time, and it controls my telescope, schedules everything for every night, and then it allows, if I don't intercede, then it basically updates its database inside itself and just keeps shooting until it completes everything that's been planned. So
Don't tell us everything, David. Save some for when you're on the show.
Okay, well,
That sounds like an interesting automation presentation, and we're always interested in those kinds of bits of software. So we'll see you in 3 weeks, and of course, stay with us during the program. And tonight, Jon is going to be telling us. Well, I guess he's going to expand a little bit and talk a little bit about CCD and about CMOS. And if you haven't already switched to a CMOS camera, I know you're thinking about it. And maybe you have a little bit of both. So Jon's going to give us a little bit of insight in how to set up and get the best out of a CMOS camera. And Jon, if you're ready to go, the show is yours.
Okay, let me share my screen and make sure this is all going to work. Stand by just a second. Okie doke. Hopefully, whoops, let me go back to the beginning here. Hopefully you guys can see that.
Yeah, looks good.
Yeah, good.
We can see it. It looks great.
All right, well, great. Let me hide this little guy down here. Whoops. Can you still see anything? Whoops.
We're looking at the Meet window screen.
Uh-oh. Okay.
You might seem to restart your presentation.
Yeah, let me just restart here. Let me go find. There we go. How's that?
That's great, Jon.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for having me here this week, guys. I wish everybody has a great Christmas and holiday coming up here at the end of the week, and hopefully everybody will get some neat Astro toys. So tonight I'm going to talk about kind of how to get the best out of your new CMOS camera, and maybe some of you will be getting one for Christmas. This is a presentation I did in the spring at the Advanced Imaging Conference out in San Jose. And it basically talks about, you know, what's the difference between CCD and CMOS technology? What do we really do when we image? How to characterize your system, a little bit about noise. And there's a couple little equations in here, but they're pretty simple and equations you kind of need to know. The big part about this and the leveraging part about the presentation is, how do we figure out what the right exposure time is? You know, some people shoot from home, others shoot from dark sites. What's the right exposure time? Well, I'm going to get into that a little bit. And there's a couple of very simple equations that work extremely well. I have one of the new back illuminated CMOS cameras or BCI cameras, and I'm going to talk a little bit about darks and biases. Do you really need to use them? And then a few little things about some tests I did of really short exposures, and it kind of builds a little bit about what Richard Wright was talking about several months back when it comes to short exposures. And I did a test with him, and I'm going to show you guys that stuff, and then some takeaways, and then what we think maybe coming up in the future. So starting, how we typically image. Well, you know, when we image, we collect photons. The more of those that we collect, the brighter the image or our target is. Our cameras collect those photons, and those photons are converted to electrons, and then they're counted. We see that count as, if we look at our image, they typically show up as analog to digital units, ADUs, in our images, in our image processing programs and so forth. But if our cameras were perfect, you know, no matter what the exposure length was, if you have a certain exposure time, the electron count would always be the same. So the example I'm going to show is if we take a 1 hour exposure, maybe we record 1,000 electrons, right? If we take 6 10-minute exposures, which equal that 1 hour, we still record 1,000 electrons across those images. And if we take 60 1-minute exposures, well, we still get 1,000 electrons. The problem, however, is our cameras are not perfect. And the other issue is photons arrive sort of randomly. So the electron count is random also. And in the end, the quality of our image is really determined by the number of photons converted to electrons that we collect. The more photons to electrons, the brighter the image. So why don't we just take an hour exposure? Well, the chances are that exposure is going to be ruined by guiding, clouds, or something, you know, out of our control. And that something out of our control is a pretty high factor over that hour. So we don't really do that. Most amateur astronomers, astro imagers have learned to take many short exposures. And when we do this, there's a less likelihood that they're going to be ruined. And we take those and we stack them, you know, in our processing software to reduce the higher noise that's in those shorter exposures. Hopefully we approach the noise level in that single long subframe. And not every photon gets counted and converted to an electron, as it really depends on the sensor quantum efficiency, or QE, and the accuracy of this thing called the analog to digital converter. We also have thermal noise and random noise that adds to that electron count. However, we do cool our cameras, and that reduces the thermal noise quite a bit. Random noise, however, destroys detail, and it's made up of two things: read noise and shot noise. Read noise is kind of the inaccuracies in that analog to digital converter in our camera. So it's kind of a camera dependent thing. And shot noise is sky dependent. It's different depending upon where you are, how bright your sky is, how dark your sky is. So, you know, that random noise is really what messes up the faint detail. So taking a look at CCDs and CMOS, both have been around for quite a while. CCDs obviously are charge coupled devices. The charge is read off the chip, and it's read all at one time. An analog to digital converter within the camera converts each photo site into a digital value, the ADU. CCD chips typically use a global shutter, which is, you know, it reads out all at once, is what that means. And these cameras typically read out slower than most CMOS cameras that are available now, but they typically produce low noise images. They typically have very little pattern noise. They have low to moderate read noise, most likely. At least most of the recent ones do. They do consume a lot of power, however, and they do consume about 100 times the power of a typical CMOS camera. And CCDs typically are pretty costly to produce. So CMOS means complementary metal oxide semiconductors. The difference here is each pixel contains its own little analog to digital converter, versus the CCD, which has one in the electronics of the camera. A CMOS has, every pixel has one of these guys. And each one of the photo sites is read out individually and then output, to your software. CMOS chips usually use what's called a rolling shutter. It reads out line by line, and they have typically a very fast readout rate, really, really quick. Now, the early CMOS cameras, say maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago, typically produced more noise than CCDs, but that's no longer the case now. And early CMOSs were typically less sensitive due to the extra electronics that is next to each one of the pixels. Each one of them has that analog to digital converter. So that blocked some of the light. But that's no longer the case either, as camera manufacturers have developed the back illuminated cameras, which gets rid of that gets rid of that blockage. So CMOSs typically have tended to have more pattern noise, although that has basically almost gone away, and we're in the CCD realm now with those. They have typically very low read noise, which is a really interesting aspect of these cameras. Typically 3 to 10 times less than a CCD. And they consume very low power, and they are typically much lower cost-wise to produce than a CCD camera. So we've seen this gigantic move to CMOS sensors. Well, why has that happened? And the real answer is it's the global market. On the left, if you look, the CMOS market value was valued at $16.9 billion a couple of years ago in 2020. And expected to reach, a value of around $28 billion in a few years. The CCD market was really valued at about $2 billion. And, it's still growing a little bit. And CCD sensors are still used in certain applications, but the CMOS market has really taken off. And because of that, there's been huge technology advances, especially in the last 4 to 5 years. This technology is in just about anything that has a camera nowadays, from your car to your cell phone to your security system maybe you have at your house, to just about.
Because somebody posted on YouTube that I'm working on it. Let's see. Oh, the button booming again.
And just holler at me when you want me to continue.
Yeah. Oh gosh, I don't even know what to do. All right, 1 second.
Molly, do you want to change over?
Yeah, I'm gonna. And we'll try again. Okay.
Wait, Linda just said you were back now. Hold on.
Yeah, I just came back in. So. Okay.
Okay, we're good to go.
I think so. What the change I just made should come back in a couple of seconds, but we should be good. So yeah, go ahead. I'll interrupt you again if we have another problem.
Okay, yeah, just holler at me.
Yep.
So we were talking about the front illuminated structure on a chip, and this is also the way CCDs are made. We have a little micro lens over each pixel, and then you have the some wiring and some electronics, and then you have the pixel. Well, that would block some light. So, years ago, there was back illuminated CCDs, very expensive. And now we have back illuminated CMOS cameras, which are not nearly as expensive. And basically, they've moved a lot of the substrate to the back side of the pixel. So really, there's no blockage of light. And this has really increased the quantum efficiency of these cameras. Like I said, this technology has been around even for CCDs, although it was a super expensive option. Probably some of the NASA purchased CCDs used for some of the, space missions were back illuminated type CCDs. And now we have fairly inexpensive back illuminated CMOS cameras. We also have gone from 12 to 14-bit CMOS cameras up to full 16-bit now with the latest cameras. And very large well depths comparable to all CCDs, and no amp glow. And if any of you have used CMOS cameras that maybe 4 to 6 years ago, you probably know what the amp glow looked like, and that is gone with these new cameras nowadays. Up at the top, the few of the cameras at the time I put this together that employs this new technology, obviously the IMX 455, which is the chip I use in the 6200 camera and the QHY 600, the IMX 571 in the 2600 is just the baby brother of the 6200, the 410 and the 533, and there may be one or two more now that have come to the consumer market since then. But these are all the new technology type CMOSs that are very, very sensitive and no amp glow. So I attended the Texas Star Party a few years ago, and I was looking to buy a new camera. I was having, I had a pretty decent CCD camera at the time that worked pretty well. And I talked to a lot of the people, and most of these people, to be honest with you, at the time were young kids, and they were using, these CMOS cameras. And I asked them, I said, hey, what do you guys like about these things? Well, they really love the low read noise. And I'll tell you what, they were onto something with that. But you have to decide on a gain and an offset. And many of them mentioned amp glow and problems calibrating images because of that amp glow. So I was a little bit unsure still in what I really wanted to do. But lo and behold, I attended AIC in 2019, and there QHY unveiled their QHY 600. And it was going to be offered in a color and mono chip. And they said it had 0 amp glow. And the specs on it were as good as any CCD camera that I've seen. And I was really blown away at this. I was like, you got to be kidding me. This is pretty interesting. 50,000 electrons of well depth, quantum efficiency up as high as 90%, which was really, really amazing. I mean, CCDs really can't touch that unless you buy like a research grade chip or something. They had a 16-bit analog to digital converter. Now this particular chip is 60 megapixels, so it's pretty big, and it has small pixels, but the specs were just pretty awesome. So I was really interested when I heard about this. And then it was just a month or so after that, the ZWO advertised their new camera, which was based on the same chip, which is called the 6200. And it was announced in the fall of 2019. Again, the IMX 455 chip, same general specs. The cost was a little bit less, and it had a few less options than the QHY camera. But still, it was, the thought was it would work just about as well, and it was going to be available early in 2020. So I looked at the forums, and, there's always a bunch of people that get these cameras early, and they post a lot of stuff on Cloudy Nights about them. And I read just about everything I could. And the hardest thing, for those of us that spend a lot of money on this hobby is, how do you convince your significant other or your wife or whoever that you're gonna need to buy a new piece of equipment that's pretty expensive. How do you say this is a good deal? but I was able to do that, and I got the 6200 Pro, so the mono version. I ordered it in May and I got it in July, during COVID. So this was kind of interesting that, China really hadn't had too much of an issue up to that point. So they were still working, and the camera arrived. That's the camera I have now. So let's take a look at how these BSI CMOS or back illuminated CMOSs compare to other chips. Well, they have very small pixels. Some people like that, some people don't. If you have a little refractor, it's a good thing. If you have a big 1 meter telescope, 5,000 meters focal length or millimeters focal length, that's probably not a really good thing. But they do work very well for most moderate to small instruments, and that's what most amateur astronomers have. They have excellent QE, and they have super low read noise. Taking a look at the little graph here, or the little table, the latest generation CCD for astronomy that's been commercially available was the 16200, KAF 16200. 6 micron pixels, pretty decent read noise for that camera, 6 to 8 electrons, pretty good well depth. I had a KAF 8300 chip in a camera, and I'm sure a lot of you do. It was also a very decent camera, produced some great images with it. The 16803, those of you with maybe bigger scopes and longer focal length systems, that was also a great camera. It's been around for quite a while, has a huge well depth. And then the Sony CCD, the ICX 694, and some of the Starlight Express cameras and some other manufacturers' cameras was about the most efficient CCD available at that time. However, it was a very small chip. And you can see, really the IMX 455, the quantum efficiency just blows the rest of them away. It's pretty amazing. It averages around 72 to 73% across the spectrum, and peaks at about 90% in the blue-green area, so right around the 03 wavelength. And the read noise is extremely low, 1.5, 1.6 electrons to about 3.6. So it's really, really in another level when it comes to read noise. And then this is common with even a lot of these other new CMOS cameras that are out there now. And the well depth is actually decent, 50,000 electrons, at least using what's called low gain and 1x1 binning. So the read noise in these new CMOS cameras depends on the gain. Again, they have really good well depth, and they are typically surprisingly less expensive than most CCD cameras. So it fits the bill for a lot of people that are getting into the hobby. So the first thing one should do when you get a new camera, and this really is, there's no difference between CCD and CMOS here. No matter what camera you have, you need to characterize it. The reason why you do is you need to know some things about it. You need to know if your camera's working right. You need to know what the read noise of your camera is, what the dark current, the full well depth is, the dynamic range. So you know your camera's working within the specs that the manufacturer has said it should. So this is just a picture of a bias, a master bias for my camera. I was using high gain in this example, bin 2x2, but I threw this up there just to show you, there is no amp load. It's nothing. It looks just as clean as some of the cleaner CCDs I've used over the years. There's really nothing there hiding in the background. And I had to convince a bunch of people of this when I first got the camera. To be honest, I was an old diehard CCD guy, and I didn't believe a lot of the hype with the CMOS cameras until I actually got it and tried it. And I was like, oh my goodness, it is really as good as they say it is. So this characterization that you need to do, if you're using a CMOS, you need to do this at each gain setting that you use or you plan to use. So in the case of most of these, there's either a low gain or a high gain. With a CCD, you're stuck with the gain the manufacturer put in the camera. So, you still need to characterize it, but you don't have to worry about doing it at multiple gains. Here's another example of, this is a 600 second master dark frame. And you can see there's a few hot pixels in there. And this was taken, I believe, at -10. So yeah, it's very, very clean. So what do we do when we characterize our cameras? Well, you take a set of flats, you take a set of darks, actually 2 sets of darks, one at a short exposure, maybe like 3 to 5 minutes, and then some long exposure darks at like maybe 10 minutes. And then you take a bunch of bias frames and you put them all together, and you use a program. Let me go here. Let me back up. I think I am missing a slide. Yeah, I guess I was missing a slide. But basically, what you do is you take these images, and I use PixInsight. So there's a application within PixInsight, a script called Basic CCD Parameters. You give it 2 darks, 2 flats, and 2 bias frames, and it spits out for you all the information that you need to know about the dark current, the read noise, the full well depth, all the important numbers. There's other programs. If you use SharpCap, I believe it'll do it. CCD Autopilot will do it. If you give it the right information. There's many ways online. I'm sure there's a whole bunch of YouTube videos out there of how to figure these numbers out, and a lot of neat scripts. So go ahead and do that and find out that information. One of the other things which is nice to do is to figure out if your camera is linear or not. This is a little bit tougher to do. However, I did it with this camera because I was not sure. And in the end, it looks like it's a very, very super linear camera. And I used a method that's published on the AAF VSO website, and you can look that up, using a very low light source. And in my case, I used my light panel to do this. And it took me several rounds, but I finally got it right. And this is what the graph looked like. And then I sent the data to Adam Block and let him take a look at it because he was very interested in how the camera operated. And yeah, he thought the camera was super linear. He was pretty ecstatic about this. However, in the real low levels, you know, in the 200 ADU level area, there's a little something going on. And I haven't really, you know, thought too much more about this because it hasn't really affected any of the images that I've been able to produce. But for the most part, above that, there is very, you know, it's very flat and very little difference in standard deviation across all the frames. So yeah, so in the end, this camera turned out to be very, very linear. And I've heard a lot of good results from people that use the 2600 or the QHY 600. There's a whole thread forum on the AA VSO site about the QHY 600 camera, and it's a very linear camera also. So good things with the IMX 455 chip. However, an interesting thing that popped up is what I call the tale of 2 flats. I was very used to taking flats, obviously, with my CCDs, and with my CCDs, I noticed I needed to really bump the brightness down on my flat panel when I use 2x2 binning. Well, this is really interesting here because at 2x2, I've got the same exact brightness on my light panel as I do using 1x1 binning. And I thought about this for the longest time thinking, what is going on here? Why? This is not how my CCD operated. And I thought, man, something's wrong with the camera. Although the images look fine, you know, the flats look fine, but it just threw me for a while. Well, come to find out, and ZWO implements averaging when they bin in the software. So when you have 4 pixels that are binned to make 1 pixel, it takes the average of those pixels versus it's the way most CCD manufacturers do it is they add those pixels together. So you have a much brighter image. With the ZWO software, you don't have much change between the two. And in the end, it doesn't really make any difference how you do it. It's just that I wasn't expecting to see that. So if you have one of these cameras, check it out. I believe QHY offers the ability to sum the pixels instead of averaging them. So your camera may be a little bit different. So looking at the numbers, here is some printouts of the PixInsight basic CCD parameter script. And it gives you all this neat information about, the two darks and two bias and two flats that you gave it. But the important stuff is down here where the arrows are: the read noise, the read noise in electrons, the dark current, the full well capacity, and the dynamic range. And if you look through these, from 1 by 1 to 2 by 2 binning, the read noise doubles. Okay, it doubles, and I'll explain that in a second. When you go to gain 100 and use 1 by 1 binning, and gain 100 in this case is called high gain, the read noise drops way down, from 3 electrons to about 1.5. But then again, as you bin, look at that, it doubles. Well, the reason it doubles is because unlike a CCD where it's read out all at once, these pixels are all read out individually. So each one of those pixels has its own little bit of read noise. And when you average them all together, in the end, the read noise ends up doubling. And it's not a huge deal with a CMOS camera because the read noise is already very low and lower than just about any CCD that you could find out there. However, you just need to realize that's what happens. Same thing happens to the dark current. It changes because it's averaged. And the full well capacity is interesting. So at 1 by 1 binning, it starts out about 50,000 electrons, which is what ZWO said it should be. So that's good. Well, when you use 2 by 2 at low gain, it goes up to a whopping 200,000 electrons. So that's really interesting. And using high gain, it's very low compared to low gain, only 16,000 electrons at 1 by 1 binning. But that may not be a gigantic issue, especially if you use short exposures. And if you bin, again, it's up high, well in the respectable range of any CCD camera out there on the market. So this is a good thing for everybody to have, and you probably need to go through this if you haven't, just so you know how your camera operates and how it operates when you change gain and change binning. What changes in the numbers. So, when you go through all this, in the end, what I can say about it is, yeah, it's working like the manufacturer says it should. The read noise and well depth is exactly very, very close to what the manufacturer says it should be. However, if we use gain 100, the read noise drops way down. That's really interesting. And the read noise stays fairly low, even if I bin 2 by 2, but the well depth increases significantly. So that may be something to put in the back of my mind. However, if we do bin, we don't get 4 times the signal like we do with a CCD. We mainly just change the file size and the resolution, but we also double the read noise. So somebody may be saying, oh man, that's just awful. Well, just remember the read noise is really, really low to start with. So doubling it may not make too much of a big deal. The dark current is also really low, and I would say very, very low at moderate temperatures. I used to cool my CCD down to -20, -25 all the time. I have not found a reason yet to get my camera any cooler than -10. I mean, the little bit of advantage you get in a little less thermal noise really makes almost zero difference when you stack your images between -10 and say -20. So yeah, it makes it easier on your cooler. In the wintertime, I run it at -10, and in the summer, I run it at around -5. So let's move on a little bit, talk a little bit about noise. And I may be getting close to that 25-minute mark or so. Is there any questions out there you guys need me to answer before I move on?
Hi, John. Just a couple.
Okay.
There was one from Chandrasekhar where you made you had an example of 1,000 electrons on a particular sub, and then you talked about it being the same as shooting lots of subs at at a shorter exposure, and
Oh yeah,
stacking.
absolutely.
And I have a feeling that you might be talking about that a little bit more as we continue, but do you want to elaborate on that a little bit, please?
Well, that was just an example of, if we had in the perfect world, if we had a perfect camera, if you just took, say an hour-long exposure, I don't know how many electrons you were going to gather, but if your camera was perfect and say you got 1,000 of them, you could break the timing up and take 60 1-minute exposures, and you would still average, or if you added all those exposures up, you would still have 1,000 electrons if you had a perfect world with a perfect camera. So it was just an example to, because all we're doing here when we do imaging is we're counting, we're taking photons, turning them into electrons, and we're counting those electrons. So the more electrons we get, the brighter our images, and the cleaner our images. And it was to, just to make an example of if we had a perfect camera. Does that sort of make sense?
I've heard this before, and I'm always confused by it, and I won't belabor the point, but I do have a
Yeah.
follow-up question. So,
Yeah.
if you take a long exposure and say you get 1,000 electrons in a particular pixel,
Yeah.
and then you take a tenth of that same exposure, and you take 10 of them. If you added them together, you would get 1,000 electrons, and I understand
Yes.
that.
Yes.
But we don't add them together when we stack, we average. So how does that affect it?
Well, let me think about that for a second. I think, well, we do average, the images together, but we still count the electrons. We still count. We have a camera that's say 16-bit, and we have space there that's available for 65,535 analog to digital units. So yeah, it's tell you what, let me think about that a little bit. Let me come back.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
John Astra had another question as well, and
Okay.
it's an interesting observation that we don't see as many larger pixel size sensors out there in CMOS
Right.
like we do in CCD. And do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, no, you're exactly right, and he's exactly right. Yes, most of the CMOS cameras have small pixels. It's probably a consumer electronics, big manufacturer consumer electronics type thing. Really, there are scientific CMOS cameras out there with larger pixels. They are available. You can find them. 6-micron pixels, similar to CCDs. However, those scientific CMOS are extremely, extremely expensive. But they are out there. And maybe, in the future we'll see more of them, but yeah, they are very, very small. And I think it has to do with, more of the consumer electronics world than anything else.
Gotcha. And so final question, Tim Myers just asked, if you bin your lights, do you also have to have binned flats and darks? And so you want to speak to that for a second for us?
Yes, all your calibration frames need to be taken at the same binning and the same gain level that you took your images. Absolutely.
I think that's all
John,
we got, unless Eric has something.
Okay.
yeah, I have one comment. You mentioned earlier in your presentation that at bin 1, those cameras are more suitable to, say, a refractor at a shorter focal length. Of course, you do end up with 120 megabyte subs when you do that.
Yep.
When you bin it, of course, your subs are 30, and of course, your effective pixel size is larger, and it is, I don't want to say, it's definitely more suitable to the longer focal length. I say that because I run a 20-inch with that same sensor on it, and do bin it, just for the reason of file size and better match as far as the the arc seconds per pixel. So
Yep.
those cameras do work for a longer focal length, but you likely have to bin them.
Yes, absolutely. Yep. That's a great point, and you're absolutely right. And I didn't really mean that they were bad for long focal length, but you probably are going to get into binning all the time, and I bin a lot too. And I'll talk a little bit about that here more, actually. So, okay, well, let's move on a little bit, talk a little bit about noise. You know, noise is interesting. Here's a few definitions, and this is going to be with a couple of the few little equations I'm going to show. T, total imaging time, sub-exposure length, and number of subs. You know, P is an interesting thing. It's the sky flux. You know, in electrons per pixel per second, the signal you get from the sky. R for read noise, and then photon shot noise is S little n. So the two types of noise that we typically deal with are read noise and shot noise. The read noise, again, is the random inaccuracies in the analog to digital converter. But we can measure that by characterizing our system, like we just talked about. Shot noise, however, is a little bit different. That's due to photons arriving in a random manner. And that a little bit depends on the sky flux, or a lot of it depends on the sky flux. You know, how bright is your sky? Do you live in an area that has a lot of light pollution, so you have a very bright sky, or do you image in an area that has a very dark sky? That'll change your shot noise quite a bit. So a couple of the equations I'm going to ask you just to look at real quick, and then we'll come back to them after. This thing called single frame shot noise, photon shot noise, is simply the square root of the sub-exposure length times the sky flux. That's all that is. The single frame total noise, we have to add in read noise, is the square root of the read noise squared plus the photon shot noise squared. And then last, we have this thing called stack total noise. So we take all our images and we stack them all together. Well, the total noise in that stack is the square root of the number of images, the number of subs that you have, times the read noise squared. And this is going to be an interesting value here later on. Plus, you know, the total imaging time times the sky flux. So these little three equations, and, you know, don't worry about writing them down because you can watch this video again on YouTube next week. So I just wanted to throw those out there. And, you know, a lot of my presentation came from a lot of the work that Dr. Robin Glover has done. And he's the guy who developed SharpCap. And you haven't watched his video about imaging with CMOS cameras, you should. It's available on YouTube. He goes into a lot greater detail than I'm going to go into. And a lot of it applies just as much to CCDs as it does CMOS. So, all right, about noise. Well, noise ruins faint detail. And here's an example of a very noisy image. How much noise is in this, I don't know. But the point is, I'm going to flip through a few of these. And as the noise gets less and less, you can start seeing smaller and smaller things. And faint detail starts showing up and things get sharper. And yeah, look at that. Now we're at, I think we're at the point now where what I would call typically, and what most imagers shoot for to get a fairly clean image, is about 5% read noise compared to sky noise. You know, we try to reduce this read noise by taking lots and lots of images and stacking them together. And this is kind of what happens when you do that. Your image gets much sharper. Oh, I guess I have one more. Yeah, that's the what about 5% read noise looks like. You know, you get a little bit of graininess in the background, but the details have really popped out. So that's a visual that show you how much, you know, noise, reducing the noise makes a huge difference, especially in very faint things and faint detail. So we have this thing called sky flux, and I touched on this a little bit. This is where we're going to leverage kind of what we have now to figure out our exposure times. We need to figure out, how do we find out what the sky flux is at our site? What is the signal that we get from the sky? And there's several methods to do this. SharpCap has a method, and you can see the link there. It's a really interesting method that I've tested for almost a year now, and it is very, very accurate. PixInsight also has a script that'll do it called the Sky Limited Exposure script. It's down there at the bottom of the script. This value called background flux is that same value. And I know CCD Autopilot will do this, and there's other methods, other software and other methods to do it. But I'm going to focus really on the SharpCat method, which is this online calculator over on the right. So all methods, no matter how you do it, you need to supply certain things to figure out what the sky flux is. You need to know some details about your system, which is why, again, we characterized our camera. You need to know the read noise. You need to know the gain. You need to know your full well depth. And you need to compute this sky flux through different filters if you have a mono camera. And if you change gain, you probably, I don't think you're gonna have to mess with it because the sky flux would stay the same, but you definitely need to do it through different filters. And most all these methods that I've tried all come up with about the same answer. So the easy one that is really easy to use is the SharpCat method. And this fits into how do we find this optimal exposure time? Well, the very simple equation is this guy right here. It's really simple. It's this value C times the read noise squared divided by the sky flux. And all C is a multiplication factor, which you determine, and it's directly related to how much noise you want in your image at the end. Again, most amateur astro imagers, through trial and error, especially the guys that grew up with CCDs, we determined over the years that, we had to take exposures of a certain length. And in the end, we had very noise, fairly low noise images, and that noise level was about 5%. So that's where the 5% sort of comes from. But that doesn't stop you. You can go lower than that if you want. You can shoot for 2% noise or 1% noise, or maybe higher. Maybe you make the decision here on that. But you definitely need to know your read noise, and you need to know this value P. Well, to find that value P, you use this calculate sky background electron rate. And it's a very simple calculator. It's online. You just put in, you tell it what your sky magnitude is, or your Bortle number, or your limiting magnitude, a little bit about your scope, your F ratio, your camera, pixel size, quantum efficiency. And you can go to the manufacturer's website to get that quantum efficiency from your camera. And then your filters, whether you're using a monochrome or a color camera, and it gives you the option of, like luminance, RGB, and then you select the bandwidth if you want to do it through a narrowband filter. And in the end, you get this value, and the value is the sky electron rate of how many electrons per pixel per second are coming into that camera. And of course, as you can think, a bright sky, you're going to have more of these. The sky flux is going to be quite a bit higher than a really dark sky. But this is a very, very accurate way to do it. So however you decide to do it is up to you. I do it this way, and this way is just a wonderful way, and it works really well. And one of the benefits is this way you can all you need to know, if you know this, all about your system. If you know what the sky magnitude is, you can figure out prior to going to like a star party or going someplace else how long your exposure should be, using that electron rate and this method up here, this little equation. There's another example, another tool called the Gibraltar Astronomical Society Subexposure Calculator. And again, you put in a lot of the same information into this, and it gives you an answer at the end, which is extremely close to the exact same answer as that little formula, except that little formula is much quicker than this method here. So you're welcome to use this method. It works really, really well. And again, it gives you about the same answer. PixInsight will give you almost the same answer also, using the calculate sky limited background script. So so there's multiple ways to get this exposure time calculation. So let's look at it as an example to show you how this all works. So we're going to use an f8 scope. We're going to bin one by one. Our read noise is 7 electrons. We're using a 16200 camera, CCD, and we're using a luminance filter, and we're in a dark sky, 21.5. Our camera averages about 50% QE, according to the manufacturer. It has 6 micron pixels, and we're going to shoot for the typical convention of I don't want my read noise to contribute more than 5% of my total noise in my stack when I'm all done. And I'm going to calculate this skyflux using the SharpCap skyflux calculator. Okay, so I've done that calculation, and the skyflux, if I put those values in, is 0.71 electrons per pixel per second. So if I take, remember that equation I had, the square root of S times P? If I take a 60-second exposure times the skyflux, I get this value, 42.6 electrons per pixel. And if I take this square root of that, that's my photon shot noise, 6.53 electrons per pixel. So my single frame total noise now is, I need to add in my read noise, okay? So the square root of 7, my read noise was 7 electrons, plus the photon shot noise, which was 42.6 from up here, comes out to be 9.57 electrons per pixel of single frame total noise. So now what I want to do is I want to figure out, well, how much of that read noise was added to my total shot noise? Well, it's a pretty simple way to do it. You just subtract the single frame total noise minus the single frame photon shot noise. You get 3 electrons per pixel contributed to the noise, and that came from the read noise, okay? So what percentage of that was added to the photon shot noise? Well, in this case, it was 32%. So I was looking for 5%, but in this particular example, it's 32%. Well, how long do I need to expose to get down to that 5% noise level? Well, in this case, 10 times R squared over P. To get down to 5% total read noise with this particular camera, I'd have to expose for 690 seconds. And that's not a crazy number. Most experienced astrophotographers would tell you with their CCDs in a very, very dark sky, they would typically shoot probably 10-minute sub-exposures using a luminance filter. You know, I used to do that with mine. That's about what it was. So that's kind of in line with what I thought it should be. Well, let's take another example. This time we're going to use this IMX 455 chip. Same telescope, same binning. However, I'm using low gain and my read noise is very low, 1.57 electrons. My camera QE is now 70% average across the entire spectrum from blue into HA. You know, it's about 70%. Yes, it peaks at 90, but the average is more like 72, 73%. And I have very small pixels, 3.76 microns. And again, we're going to look at 5% total noise. So doing the calculation, finding out, using that online tool to find out what the background skyflux is, using this camera, it comes out to this value here, 0.39 electrons per pixel per second. So doing the same calculation, my total skyflux ends up being 23.4 electrons per pixel, and my photon shot noise is 4.84 electrons per pixel. My single frame total noise is 5.09 electrons per pixel. So now let's look and see. This time with this camera, I had 0.25 electrons per pixel of read noise that was added in, much lower. And the percentage of read noise is right there, close to 5%. So this is pretty amazing. A 60-second exposure with the back illuminated CMOS gets me down to that 5% noise level in a dark sky versus a nearly 10-minute exposure with the other camera, which had higher read noise. And it's all about the read noise in this case. That's why you have to shoot longer, because of the higher read noise. The read noise makes all the difference in the world. This little table just shows you, depending upon the focal ratio of your scope and the brightness of your sky, what you can expect for sky electron rates, and down here, recommended exposure times. And I want to key in just on this here. So using an f6 scope, which a lot of people have, and a lot of imagers use f6 scopes. With that same CCD, you typically would have to shoot for about 90 seconds at f6 in a suburban sky, or 10 minutes in a dark sky. This is a crazy low number, I know, 8 seconds, but that's at the 5% noise level. You can go a lot lower with these newer low noise cameras, maybe down to 1%, which would be a little bit higher number, more reasonable. But about 60 seconds in a dark site. And that's exactly about what I used last year when I went to the Okie-Tex Star Party. I think I had about 60-second exposures for luminance. I know my color was longer, about 4 minutes, but because you have to figure out this exposure time through all your filters. Remember that. And I will say that, yeah, narrowband filters, these values get multiplied by quite a bit, but it's so easy to figure out. You can go through your system and figure all these exposure times out fairly quickly. But I wanted to show you that table. This is a graph that shows the stack noise versus exposure time. So what is an exposure time that if you went above it, you really wouldn't gain any value when it comes to noise in your images or in your stack. And really what this graph shows is the green line is this typical CCD again, and you reach that level of no return or no added value at about 240 seconds. You reach it with a CMOS at about 60 seconds. So that just says, if you shot any longer than that in that particular sky with that particular telescope, you really wouldn't gain any noise benefit by doing it. So yeah, it's pretty good difference there between the two types of cameras. So here's just a fun example of total stack noise between these two cameras. And I'm going to go through this quick since we're getting towards the end here. But basically, you guys can look at all this next time we went through all the calculations. The only difference is this total stack noise, which I showed this equation earlier, is you have to add in the number of your images times the read noise squared. And this is the point where the read noise squared, or the high read noise cameras, this is where it gets you because this value becomes large. So what I did was I calculated it with the 16200. The recommended exposure time in this example was about 169 seconds. We're going to do 5 hours of them. That's 107 exposures. That's our sky fluxes over here. This was the low gain IMX 455 recommended exposure, 76 seconds. And in the end, we had 368 electrons of total stack noise with that 5 hour stack. Okay, but we also got a 10 times signal to noise increase. And if you don't know how to figure that out, it's pretty simple. It's the square root of the number of exposures or the number of subframes that you have. So you have 100 subframes, you get about a 10 times signal to noise increase. Looking at the CMOS, the back illuminated CMOS, I only had 282 electrons of total stack noise with this at low gain. And I got a 15 times signal to noise increase in the end. And if you were really crazy, and I did that really short exposure thing, and I took really 1,200 exposures, which is nuts. But people have done this, and especially guys and gals that use DSLR cameras. I saw one person that took like 15,000 subframes and stacked them together. And it was the most beautiful low noise image I've ever seen. So it can be done. You may need a supercomputer to do it, but the point here I wanted to show is you get exactly the same number no matter if you're using low gain or high gain here. Yeah, I got a 35 times signal noise increase, but my initial short exposure had a little bit more noise in it in the end. So this is just a good fun example to show the difference in how much noise you get in the CCDs versus the CMOS cameras. And it's really all about this term here, because the read noise is squared. Higher read noise, you square that number, it becomes a quite a bit larger number. This was an example of what I did with my QSI camera I used to have. I used to shoot about 5 minutes at home with luminance, and a dark side I'd have to go quite a bit longer. And then to get down to this 2% noise level, I'd have to shoot for quite a bit, like not quite 15 minutes, but 12, 13 minutes. Using the new camera, that value went way down to 80 seconds at home. And then the 2% noise level, 200 seconds. So, I may want to shoot for really low noise levels now, and I shoot, maybe 200-second exposures if I want. It's really up to you to decide what value you want to use in that case. So what about darks with these new cameras? Well, on the left is a 180-second sub calibrated with just a master bias. And over on the right is one with a master dark. I can't tell much difference between the two. I doubt if you can either. The deal here is you have to dither your images if you want to use just bias frames. But these cameras are so low when it comes to thermal noise. Yeah, it's like the old Starlight Express CCDs that a lot of people always say, yeah, I don't need to use darks, I just use biases. Well, I tested that, and it's true with this camera. You don't necessarily need to. And here's a stack of 30 3-minute subs. Over on the left, just calibrated with a master bias. Over on the right, calibrated with a master dark. There's no difference in the noise standard deviation. There's no difference in the image. It looks just as good no matter which way you do it. So I'll leave that up to you to decide. If you do want to try it, make sure you test your camera out to make sure you can do this. But definitely the IMX 455 and the iteration I have, it works really well, perfectly. So what about binning? Well, again, binning, when you bin a CMOS camera, the read noise doubles because you're doing 4 readouts. And you take the square root of that and you get a double read noise. You don't get that with CCDs because the binning is set by the manufacturer. However, with the CCD, you get a signal to noise increase 4 times when you bin. You don't get that with the CMOS, but you get a little bit. You get a 2 times signal to noise increase, and you get a little higher read noise. But in the end, the read noise is so darn low that it really, you're still doing yourself a favor. Even if you bin, you're not going to hurt yourself at all. So use binning to match the pixel of your optics. So gain, what's the best gain level to use? Well, typically, most manufacturers will tell you it's the point where your camera goes from low conversion gain to high conversion gain. And this graph typically is available on most manufacturers' website. This is a ZWO graph here. This is that point right here where it drops down from 3 electrons to 1.5 electrons. And in the case of my camera, it's 100 gain. Case of a QHY camera, it's a different number. I don't know what QHY uses, but I know that value's out there. But the point is, you want to, the best gain setting typically to produce short exposures. If you're a type of individual that maybe you have trouble guiding, or you have other issues that you want to take a lot of short exposures to kind of reduce how many you throw out, well, use high gain. If you're going to guide anyways and everything, well, you can use low gain. That's fine. Just remember that the read noise is just higher, So yeah, that's all I wanted to really say about gain. Just remember that binning will double the read noise. But
Hey, John.
Goes up. Yeah.
Could you maybe just to kind of level the playing field, can you tell us how many electrons per ADU that is? Do you happen to know at gain 100?
I don't know off the top of my head.
Okay, sorry. Thank you.
Yeah, that's okay. But I'm sure you can find it on the manufacturer's website. So just a couple of recommendations here. If you're shooting a really bright object, you want to get the core of M42, yeah, you probably want to use low gain so you don't blow out those stars. And you probably are still going to use very short exposures either way. If your object is really not very bright at all, which most things in the sky aren't, use high gain. You can really optimize how you do things. You may not have to guide. You can take some short exposures. You won't probably saturate your stars because you're taking very short exposures. And then narrowband, always use high gain for narrowband. You want to get the lowest read noise possible. Okay, so here's just an example of short exposure imaging. This is a shot I did of this galaxy NGC 4395. I was down at a dark sky site with Richard Wright last winter, and we did a test. What can I get just taking just 60-second exposures with my f8 telescope at a dark site? I used high gain, 2x2 binning, so I had a little bit higher read noise, about 3 electrons of read noise. I took 120 subs of 60 seconds through the LRGB filters, and I took 400 subs of 60 seconds through a 5 nanometer HA filter. Well, how did it all work? Well, it worked extremely well. I also tested it at home. I took a bunch of HA subs using my normal 20 minutes at home also and compared the two. And there was a little bit of difference. If we have to get down into the realm of 0.5 to 1 electron of read noise to really take advantage of very short, fast HA or narrowband imaging. But even at 3.2 electrons of read noise, I was still able to get a pretty decent image. Here's what they both look like. So over on the left is almost 180 60-second exposures taken through a 5 nanometer HA filter with an f8 telescope in a excuse me, in my sky here at home. Here's another example of about the same amount of time, but only 9 of them. But these were 20-minute exposures, right? So these were a lot longer. And there is a little bit of difference here in the super, super faint signal. It may not show up on your screen, but when you look at this on your monitor in an image editing program, you can see fainter stuff in the long exposure ones, a little bit fainter stuff. It's not like an, oh my goodness, difference, but the main stuff shows up in those little short exposures. So it's pretty darn amazing what you can do with very, very short exposures. And this is what the final image looked like. And this was, done from a dark sky, about a 21.4 or so sky down in South Florida. Milky Way was nice and bright overhead, and very short 60-second exposures. So, if you guide when you image, that's great. If you like guiding and you have no problems with it, great. But if you have trouble guiding, just be aware. If you have a pretty F6, F7, F5 telescope, you surely can get by taking very, very short exposures and producing really good images. And this shows it right here, even from a dark sky. All right, a couple takeaways. CMOS performance, especially the back illuminated CMOS performance, is now not arguably anymore. It is now better than older CCDs. The lower, they have much lower read noise of 3 to 10 times. They have quite a bit higher quantum efficiency, and they have excellent well depth on par with any of the older CCD cameras. Lower noise and higher QE allows your sub exposures to be much shorter for the same noise level. So that may benefit you in a way. These cameras have typically small pixels, and they may be more suited to moderate sized instruments. But as we heard earlier, you can bend these and you can match it to even a longer focal length system. There are scientific CMOS cameras out there that have large pixels, but they are super expensive still. So maybe you can afford one of those, but I couldn't. So, but they're out there if you look. You may not have to take dark frames with your camera. Do a test, try it out, see what happens. But you may. But in my case, I don't. I still use darks because that's the way I've always done it, and it may give a more accurate result. And I have a dark library, so I use them. But I surely, I tested it, and you can sure see you don't have to use them if you don't want to. Binning in software doesn't really increase sensitivity like a CCD does. Binning really does change the file size, makes the files a lot smaller, which makes a big difference when you have to stack a bunch of images. And really doesn't change your, it does increase your signal to noise ratio, but only 2 times, just not quite as much as the way CCDs worked, but you still get some benefit from it. And definitely camera cooling requirements are much less. You don't need to get these cameras as cold. If you're running your camera at -20, have at it, but you don't need to. -10 is probably as cold as you need to go. But do characterize your camera and look at what that value is in your thermal noise. The QE is really high in these cameras. It averages around 70 to 72%. Maxes out 85 to 90%. And some out there, the real expensive ones, the scientific ones, are now up to about 95% QE. So short exposures, maybe it'll allow you to gather your data without having to guide, maybe make your life easier. So there we go. So the future, this is from Richard Wright, a really good friend of mine. What he thinks is going to happen in the future. Well, we're going to get QE that's going to be close to 100%, and we're going to get read noise that's going to get really low, like down around 0.5 electrons. It's coming. It may not, I may be out of the business by the time it gets here, but you young folks will definitely see this. What's going to happen when that happens? Well, you're going to be taking thousands and thousands of very, very short images, kind of like the planetary guys do it now. But computational power, it doubles every couple of years, which is Moore's law. So it may not matter pretty soon that you have several thousand subs like the planetary guys have. They maybe stack 10, 20,000 subs, but they're tiny subs. You have bigger subs, and that will make a difference. You need computer power to do it. You won't need a guide because PE is not going to be an issue with really short exposures in the future. You can stack and calibrate them on the fly already. In the future, you're going to be doing this automatically, and maybe it'll take 500 short exposures, auto stack them for you, and then just output that one image, which is maybe a 5 or 10 minute sub, which you can process later. And maybe that's what it'll output to your, and save to your drive. So instead of having tens of thousands of images, the software will automatically stack them, automatically calibrate them, and provides you with a 5-minute sub, maybe 10 or 20 of those to further stack. Your 3 terabyte drive today is going to be your 3 petabyte drive pretty soon. So there is overhead and there is a duty cycle. You have to download the images. However, and it takes a little bit of time, but the cameras will get faster. It's just going to happen. There'll be AI noise reduction algorithms in the future that'll sharpen or get rid of noise on the fly, and it'll be a nice day when all this happens. So anyways, some references if you want to look up some of these calculations and some of these equations. Again, if you haven't seen some of these YouTube videos by Dr. Robin Glover, especially about CMOS cameras and noise, I urge you to watch him. He does a really super good job. And I will leave it at that. So answer any questions, and we'll go on from here. Thank you so much.
You can stop sharing if you want, John. Although that's a pretty nice planetary you got up there.
Well, that's not a planetary, but it looks pretty cool.
That's a Wolf-Rayet.
It's a Wolf-Rayet.
Yeah, it's a Wolf-Rayet. That's the Star Wars TIE fighter version of it, coming in on an angle to attack. So there it is. Okay, so let's go back.
You not only had a big audience tonight, but I think we got more people as time went by.
Yeah. So okay, well, what do we got for? I know we have questions because I had 1,000 of them when I figured all this stuff out a couple of years ago. But
well, I think you've overcome you've overwhelmed some minds out there, John, with folks you're trying to digest it all. But I think the interesting thing to me is the difference in thinking and how we approach photographing with a CCD camera versus a CMOS camera.
Yes,
And
it is
as we make the switch, there's a paradigm shift that has to go along with it. That tells us that we ought to be using these things differently in order to wring out the performance of the camera.
right. And I learned a lot of that from the young kids that were using the early cameras. But you're right, it is a paradigm shift, and it took me a long time to realize it, and took me a long time to go along with it. And I had my doubts, but yeah, here we are 3 years in, and it's the most wonderful thing I've ever seen now. So
Yeah, we've definitely with these cameras gone to shorter and shorter exposures.
yeah.
We haven't got all the way to non-guiding. I guess we're not standing close enough to Richard Wright for that yet.
Well, he challenged me to try this test, and I said I wasn't sure. I said, "Really? You think I could take a really short?" Because I have a slow telescope, f8. Those with f5 and f6 scopes can get away with it really easy, but mine is f8. So I said, okay. So he challenged me, and I tried it, and I was completely surprised at maybe my noise level, my final stacked image was a little bit more than if I had taken longer exposures, but boy, I couldn't tell. It was hard.
Well, so the advantages and the disadvantage was you had to handle a bunch more subs.
Yes, there is
And
definitely a disadvantage. You have to have a fast computer, and um, I had to process, I think I had a total of about 500 subframes. So I hit the button, and I use PixInsight most of the time, and I use WBPP to do it. So I clicked the button, I walked away, and came back 4 hours later.
but on the other hand, the only thing you had to do for the long exposures was guide.
Correct.
So you were comparing what, five? I can't remember, 100, 1,000. Can't remember what.
Well, I was really doing the comparison. I wanted to see what I could do using narrowband filters. What is can I get a decent image? And yeah, I can do better if I guide and take longer exposures. Absolutely. However, I can do that. The 25-year-old that just bought his first telescope and mount may not be able to do that. And this gives people another option out there to produce great images. There's nothing wrong with guiding. There's nothing wrong with, this isn't a thing about CCDs versus CMOS. There's nothing wrong with CCD cameras. They produce wonderful images. You just need to use them differently. And, you need to use the CMOS cameras differently, and they open up some options that CCDs didn't give us.
Well, I think once you get to on-camera processing, I think then the whole game will change again. Because at that point, there is no need of guiding. If you can register image in real time, stack it up, and spit out a single stacked, if not totally processed image, then that's the game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's a lot of cool stuff coming, and this is just the beginning of it now. So I probably won't be around to see it, but some of you will.
No, we'll all be around to see it. I plan on being around. How about you, Tim, Molly? We know Molly's going to be around.
I ain't going
anywhere. Some of the onboard stacking stuff, like smartphones right now, like when you take a nighttime, like a night exposure image,
absolutely,
it's not taking a long exposure. It's taking a ton of short exposures and stacking them.
Oh yeah,
and that's with the mobile chips that are already on there. So it's coming soon.
Oh yeah. It's already being done. Actually, the SkyX can auto stack on the fly, right now.
And so, Sharpcat's been able to do that for quite a while.
Yeah.
Just like not with there's settings that you would want to tweak, like if you were doing it yourself in PixInsight, but yeah, we're getting there pretty quick.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but we have to do it to the quality of the images that we're producing now. And I think like SharpCat doesn't quite, it does it for another purpose. It does their live stacking. When they can do it to the same quality to what we have, then sure.
Yeah.
We're going to sell our cameras and get those.
The thing that really surprised me, this whole, going through this whole process and learning how these equations really work and how to figure out the right exposure time. The thing that got me was, as an experienced CCD guy, we'd always shoot for, I didn't know it at the time, but our exposure lengths were based on what we thought was a decent a low noise image. And it turns out that's very close to this 5% noise level that I talked about. You know, so when I used to go to a star party, I'd take a 10-minute sub exposure, use an illuminance filter through the CCD, and I got about the same noise level as I get now at 60 seconds. So, you know, it's really amazing where we've come. So
I don't think we actually thought about how long to take an exposure. Someone just said 15 minutes, 10 minutes, and we did it.
right.
I didn't think about it any. I thought about how many times a plane is going to fly through my image if I take a 10-minute exposure,
Yeah.
and how many I'm going to lose. If I take a 30-minute, I know the plane's going to fly through it.
Yeah.
So,
I will say with narrowband imaging, you do need to take long exposures, even with these low noise cameras. But once the noise, you know, once the read noise gets down, you know, 0.5 electrons, and they're out there now. I mean, I looked online, I could find several cameras that had read noise of about 0.5 electrons. Very expensive. You know, not at the Astro, you know, amateur Astro imager type scale, but super expensive, but they're there. And that technology, you know, eventually is going to come into our type of camera too. So yeah, once you get there, yeah, long exposures are, you know, you're going to do everything real short stuff. So, because it's all about read noise, you know, it's all about read noise.
Do you have your slides available somewhere, like a public share link or something? Or is that something you would be willing to do?
Well, yeah, I can. And I would tell anybody, like I said, I did this presentation at the Astro Advanced Imaging Conference. That video is available free of charge for anybody to watch. You can watch all the AIC videos this year for free. So all you have to do is navigate to their site. You can find my presentation there.
I was thinking more for like the streaming quality on this channel, since we're live. I don't know what the streaming quality on the slides on the AIC videos look like offhand.
Yeah.
But it's hard to read the text on a lot of your slides. That's why I was thinking to post them.
Oh, okay. Yeah, absolutely. I'll send me an email and I will load them up to like a Dropbox or something, and you can grab them all. So.
Okay. And yeah, and for those watching, I'll put that link into the video description once I get that.
Right. Perfect. Yeah. Yeah. I have no problem with that at all. So
yeah, that'd be great. Thanks.
You're welcome.
any more questions, Tim? Anybody?
No, I think we've got them all. John, thank you so much for a terrific presentation.
Okay. Well,
absolutely excellent.
Great.
So before we say goodnight for the year, Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, or whatever holiday you celebrate for the new year. And I guess we'll see everyone next year.
Yep, next year.
Next year.
All right.
Princess Wave.
I'll take us out. Good night, all.
Princess Wave.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.